Prepare for severe impacts of nationwide mass evictions. The U.S. credit card debt crisis begins. Hi, folks, and welcome to the Financial Argument. There are two ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword, the other is by debt. These methods to subjugate the masses mentioned by John Adams 2 centuries ago are still effective, and I think it's safe to say they're both in use nowadays. I won't discuss the sword method today because I want to give attention to how a nation can be enslaved by debt. The situation is quite serious and concerns every American. It doesn't matter if you're current on your bills, how much credit card debt you have, what your credit score is, or if you've ever even used a credit card in your life. It doesn't matter if you're a tenant or a landlord. This concerns everyone. What I'm referring to is the economic and social suffering that millions of Americans will experience in the dead of winter as they're forced to choose between debt and homelessness. I don't need to explain to you how difficult the last couple of years have been. Many of those affected were barely able to keep a roof over their heads, if at all. On the other side of the coin, we've seen landlords who in the past couple of years have had difficulty collecting rent but are still responsible for their mortgages, property taxes, and other bills. Yes, many people like to view landlords as greedy slumlords. But according to the 2018 Rental Housing Finance Survey, 41% of the rental units in the United States are run by individuals, mom-and-pop operations. 48% of rental units belong to properties with 1 to 4 units, 72.5% of which have individual owners. There are more people than many would like to think who are vulnerable to the economy. Do you see the domino effect and how it isn't just certain sectors of society that are affected? Some people have been able to save and minimize their spending over the last couple of years. Others who had the means to pay their rent squandered their money, expecting the government to take care of them. Many even played around in the stock market with money they couldn't afford to lose. The trillions of dollars printed won't be without consequence. As I always say, prepare for the worst because the results will be devastating. Consider the danger of food shortages, another severe problem that I often discuss in my videos. According to the Census Bureau's 2019 estimates, renters account for about 36% of the country's 122.8 million households. We know the CDC ended the eviction moratorium last year, although some localities extended it and implemented protections for renters. What will be the consequences of these evictions when tenants no longer have financial or government assistance? We know certain demographics, such as those living below the poverty level, young people, and minorities, tend to be more likely to rent. Try to figure out who the culprit behind this game is. In order to fully explain what's really going on behind the scenes, I'll start by going back in time a bit. Let's take a look at Jessica Dickler's report for CNBC on March 8, 2021. In the article entitled "Americans Paid Off a Record $83 billion in Credit Card Debt in 2020", Dickler tells us that, thanks to the health crisis, consumers are paying off their debt and saving more than they have in decades. In many ways, the crisis paved the way for better budgeting. Well, how enlightening. Fortunately, the health crisis taught many how to make better budgets, pay their debts, and be good girls and boys. I guess that means everything's okay then, right? But for some reason, this news doesn't mention the last few years that have been an ordeal for the American people. Sure, credit card debt is down. What about unaccounted for health expenses and costly medical bills waiting in the mailbox? What about people who used credit card purchases for more extensive shopping years ago, but in the face of recent massive price hikes, now just buy the bare minimum necessary to survive? What about rents that have dramatically increased in the last few years and will increase even more in 2022? What about those who spent their stimulus checks to pay off their debts just to come up for air and get rid of some of the psychological stress created by debt? What demographic of people are actually saving some money? I'd wager it's those who weren't living from paycheck to paycheck when the crisis began. The author does not mention those who resort to paying their rent with a credit card. Many people have two choices in front of them: homelessness or debt. Most Americans are forced out of desperation to choose debt and shackle themselves to creditors and interest payments. Even if they don't lose their homes, millions of Americans will continue to suffer from debt-ridden financial pain. When you look at this graph, you can see how exacerbated the situation has become. According to a 2020 analysis by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, there was almost a 70% increase in people paying rent by credit card compared to the previous year. The more recent data that I'll show you shortly is even worse. We must understand that many Americans are now running out of savings. Many have exhausted their family members, resorting to borrowing money from them and running up the balance on their credit cards. The situation has become paradoxical. As you can see in this chart from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, almost 20% of renters reported that they fell behind in rent payments during the crisis. According to data that compares estimates from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, the National Council of State Housing Agencies, and Parrott and Zandy, it's estimated that the back rent owed in the USA at the beginning of 2021 ranged from $8.4 billion to $52.6 billion. What we see is that reliance on credit cards to pay bills is increasing debt in the United States. In a survey conducted by Apartment List, results showed that more than a third of renters have dipped into their savings accounts. 23% have increased credit card debt since the health crisis began, and almost a third of renters resorted to borrowing money from family and friends. At the time this data was released, 45% of those surveyed who were worried about losing housing owe more than $1,000, with many owing much more. Now, with what I'm about to show you, you'll see why I'm warning you about how many will be hit hard. The problems contained in these studies covering the past year are still present today, because no economic savior has come and will not come. Their solutions and propaganda have been the same for years. The economic situation is now worse than last year. High inflation, increased prices, a supply chain crisis. You know the story. We all live in anticipation of what's to come, and we're feeling what is to come in our wallets. The high rental increases are one of the most crucial factors that will lead to financial disaster. A study released by Zumper in December of 2021 shows rent increases for one-bedroom units increased by average of 11.6%. The average rent increase for two-bedroom units jumped 13.6%. Rents are at an all-time high in almost the entire country, and this will continue to increase according to analysis that takes into account the rising raw material prices and supply chain problems. 51.3% of respondents surveyed stated they paid more in rent than before the health crisis. While people everywhere are feeling the sting from rent increases in 2021, it's particularly dramatic in Florida. 5 of the 10 cities with the most significant rent increases are in Florida. Miami is at 38.2%, Tampa at 38.1%, Orlando at 32.8%, Jacksonville at 27.1%, and St. Petersburg at 24.4%. One-bedroom median rent prices in December 2021 in New York were at $3,190, San Francisco at $2,810, Boston at $2,590, San Jose at $2,310, Miami at $2,280. I hope you understand how dire and serious the situation is. But that's not all. I'll spare you the details. You can find plenty of data and information yourself with a simple search. There are reports about the rent crisis coming from every corner of the country. For example, as of November 2021 in New Jersey, judges faced a backlog of over 50,000 landlord-tenant non-payment cases. You see accounts of irresponsible people who foolishly spend their stimulus checks on ridiculous things and don't pay their rent when they can. Landlords who suffer because of this, and others who pay their rent with their credit cards and the last penny in their pockets. The situation is quite complex and devastating. When we look at the big picture, the permanent financial damage the economy has sustained is even worse. In this video, I wanted to focus on the relationship between credit card debt, which is just a small portion of the overall U.S. household debt, total household debt has increased by almost $3 trillion since the health crisis began and exceeded $15 trillion. Remember the $83 million in credit card debt paid off in 2020 that I mentioned early in the video? Well, during Q3 of 2021, balances increased by $23.6 billion. According to WalletHub, average balances for one household are a little over $8,000 as of December 2021, with that number expecting to rise and estimating 2021 to wrap up with a whopping $70 billion more in credit card debt. TransUnion projects that balances will reach over $800 billion by the end of 2022. It's not difficult to guess what awaits us if we assume that the increasing prices of 2021 will lead to further increases through 2022. Although credit experts tell us unpaid debt simply means your credit score will drop and your interest rates will increase in the future. We know the reality is much more painful than that. The potential threat of eviction as a result of rental debt is forcing many people to save money and adding to their financial distress. Many people cannot make short and long-term preparations because of their urgent need for cash. If they're struggling to buy food this month, they won't think of stocking their pantries for the future, if they're even aware they need to at all. Believe me, the truth remains hidden, and many are in the dark about what's really going on. You won't find it in the mainstream media, commenting on YouTube videos, social media posts, and other outlets may be the only way some will learn about it. So I encourage you to warn others this way. They like to tell us we've overcome the worst, that it's only up from here, that the health crisis magically taught many how to budget, the markets are hitting record highs, and the only place to go from here is up. I consider it my duty to warn you as best as I can, and as I always say, prepare for the worst and keep quiet about your preparations. Many of you ask me to release videos more often. I'm trying my best and want to upload a new video twice a week, Monday and Friday. For that, I need another video editor, so bear with me, and thank you for coming back and watching. If you'd like to support me on this, visit my Patreon page. I've rearranged it and set many benefits there for the handful of people trying to keep the financial argument alive. And thank you again to the great people whose names you see on the screen. God bless you all.